So building upon the previous video where we were handling exceptions, in this video I want to talk a little bit about throwing exceptions. Typically, we would throw exceptions for a variety of different purposes, a lot of which have to do with development. We might throw an exception just to test whether or not a certain exception is being caught, or whether or not validation is working in your validation in the business logic. We may actually rethrow exceptions in terms of existing exception handling, and then rethrow an exception just to test whether or not we are actually catching and performing the proper action. We certainly also can consider some of the issues with your current piecework program. For instance, when Kyle demoed a NICE Lab 2B in class the other day, there was one of them, I believe, where he went to summary and the summary form came up and there were 0 summary values. It's like, well, why would you want to show that? So perhaps we could test the value for summary and throw an exception that we could handle, and through the handling or the catch of that exception could produce a nice message, an informative message to the user that there really isn't anything to summarize. More specifically to do with Lab 3B, one of the things you're going to be asked to do is validate inside your business logic within ranges acceptable values for the number of pieces, let's say, assembled. And so that data validation has to exist. And at the business level, when we find that something is outside of an acceptable range, or one of the arguments is outside of the acceptable range, you have to somehow pass that message back up to the calling tier. Now, we don't know in terms of truly portable code whether or not this class that you've designed is going to be implemented in an application like Visual Basic, where there's that visual side of the application. But you do have to get a message back to that calling tier, that presentation tier, or whatever tier called it. So you want to make sure you build in some validation, and when validation rules are broken, that message you pass back is an exception. And I've included a link here to the Microsoft help pages on argument exceptions that breaks down some of the different types of argument exceptions that can be thrown from within business logic. I'll take a look at some here, thinking about the set property procedure, at least the set side of your property procedures, for those property procedures that can actually write to those hidden private or protected variables. That's where this business logic validation occurs. And there's 3 possible exception types that you might throw as argument exceptions. Argument out of range, which absolutely makes sense for that range validation. Argument null exception. And then there's the overall general exception, just like the exception class itself has a basic exception. There's the everything else argument exception. For each of these, you provide at least one argument. Argument out of range and null exception require a parameter name and optionally take a message. The argument exception takes a message and optionally a parameter name. So ultimately you pass a string that represents that parameter name and error, and then you let the calling tier investigate, what is the parameter and error, and maybe construct a message, that side of things. So in terms of throwing these exceptions, we have to declare them. We have to create these exceptions before they're valid. So thinking in terms of the argument out of range exception. For my payroll program that we're going to take a look at here in a second, I've got a pay level argument, and that indicates the parameter that this exception has come from, and then I've provided a message. And then the code that handles that exception that might be caught at the presentation tier is that catch, give it a name, as an argument out of range exception. Of course, we're investigating whether or not it's the pay level or which parameter it might be that threw the exception, and in this case we're simply showing or passing on the message that came from that validation exception. We'll just take a quick look at this. I've got some validation here for hours in my payroll. There's a minimum number of hours, 1 hour, and a maximum number of hours, 60. And they have to have worked greater than or equal to the minimum or less than or equal to the maximum. And then I go ahead and I set that private object variable. Otherwise, I'm going to throw a new, so there's an instantiation of this argument out of range exception. I provide a parameter, and I provide an optional error message. And then over on the presentation tier side, I've got this handler right in the middle of my nested try catch statement. Catch an object argument exception as an argument out of range exception. I pass a message, and then I test the parameter name so that I can set the focus and select all in the appropriate text box. In the next video, we'll actually demonstrate catching exceptions, handling exceptions, and we'll also demonstrate throwing argument out of range exceptions and how this application deals with that.